sure a lot of you guys have seen this build before, and it's a little bit different this time. Actually, it's about 3 times better. The biggest difference between Perfect Agony Nightblade in previous iterations and the new version is that it relies on a unique that I hope is still T4 and doesn't get nerfed before the patch, the Covenant Chest. It gives you a 7-link with a level 29 add chaos damage support. And this is giving me something like 200% more damage on my build. Because I have so much damage, I've chosen to also actually go for the Trickster Ascendancy. Now Assassin does have more damage, especially early on in the game when you have less investment, but as long as this unique is accessible, by the end of day 1, I'd be probably having around 5 to 7 million DPS. So in that sense, it might not be the best guide to follow for you, but in general, if you can get the Covenant, you can use this on any chaos attack skill. Now it's not as good on spell skills because spells scale really well with gem levels, and then you get higher base damage. For attack skills, however, especially those using claws and gigantic multipliers, with relatively low base damage, in other words, Nightblade, Helix, the Covenant is really broken. Now it's a build also that progresses really well. We've seen really great developments recently in shadow leveling, especially because so many people have been playing Seismic the previous patch. Now when people were leveling Seismic, they actually leveled as Poison Helix, and one of the things that makes leveling this build really easy is that the moment you get Plague Bear, you can just pop Plague Bear on bosses as opposed to using that on trash mobs in the zone. It wouldn't be unreasonable for a top player to set up this way and aim for about a 3-hour Act 10. But unlike a lot of other speed racing builds, this build actually has really good early progression to maps, and also a really solid early endgame. Now it's not something I play into the deep endgame because poison builds just aren't it in the deep endgame. However, as you do continue to scale up, there potentially is the possibility of not going poison anymore and instead going crit chaos, which is another entirely different setup, but it kind of would take inspiration probably from the Replica Albron's sort of Venom Gyre thing that I saw. I think Kobe did that once upon a time. But that's sort of the idea of it. So the beauty of this build, as always, is they're reliant on a couple of really cheap core uniques, right? Ungil's Harmony and Wasp's Nest really jacks you up. Aziri's Step as a third unique is just a big pair of suppression boots. I think these are gonna be maybe a little bit expensive in SC trade, but realistically they shouldn't be, and if you're playing an SC trade, you don't actually need to suppress cap early on. Any sort of suppression works out as mitigation. The Covenant is insane. I have on the average hit 2.6 million DPS. If I take this off, I go down to 870k. And you can see it right here. It is 202.9% more damage when I put this thing on. It is absolutely broken. I really hope that we get to use this. Now, if you don't get to use this, this is still roughly the same DPS that I was running, 2 leagues ago now, on the Assassin version of Poison Helix. It looks like it's a little bit less, but I'm also not using Focus in my config, and I don't use Assassin, which means that it's not like my poisons are lasting for like 7 or 8 seconds, right? This is, I think, a 3-second poison build, so your ramp time is much faster. Glorious Vanity is the last unique. I use Glorious Vanity for 2 primary purposes. Firstly, for Trickster, having a big ES pool is really important, and with the removal of the Gravicius mod, this is even more powerful. The second thing is that it lets you go from 7 Wither stacks to 15 Wither stacks because of access to Ritual Shadows. Now that sounds a little bit troll. It sounds like you have to use Divine Orbs, which will be crazy expensive next league. Except this position allows you to have 9 different nodes that you could possibly roll Ritual Shadows on. There's a really cool function in Path of Building down here called Find Timeless Shield. If you click this and then pick the node that you want and then press search, it will give you every single number of any jewel within this location for Elemental Equilibrium in my case, that has Ritual Shadows on any of them. So I think it's roughly 6% of Glorious Vanities that I can use because you also need to roll for the right keystone, which sounds kind of bad, but except for the fact that that's still thousands of Glorious Vanities, and realistically, one in trade should be fairly accessible. Worst case scenario, you farm your own. I think it's really easy to actually target farm Glorious Vanities. I've done it several times now in SF hardcore races, and it takes me a couple hours max each time. But once you actually start getting momentum and chain farming them, you get them much more commonly. And Legion is back on the map device. As far as the rest of the gear goes, I have no implicits on gear because I want to keep this relatively cheap-ish. Basically, you just want to have defenses on your items. So things like life, suppression, resistances, and PDR when possible. You could go for some offensive things like accuracy, attack speed, focus attack speed on your glove, and I think the Elvion craft would be really helpful. And I think you need 1 strength rule total. It's a really easy build to get your attribute cap, and honestly, I think this gear is pretty dog. If you think this gear is good, then honestly, this really isn't for you. And honestly, none of my builds are probably for you. As far as the skill gem setup goes, it's really nice now. There's no weird setup, so I don't need things like Cruelty or Deadly Elements. And the final support for this build is Energy Leech support, which is really nice to be able to use, right? Because you're a Trickster, you'll have Overleech, and presumably you'll also be on full energy heals for most of the time because you have lots of sources of ES recovery. Whirling with faster attacks and flame bashes here. You can also use Shield Charge if you prefer that. However, I prefer Whirling Blades on almost every single encounter. An Assassin's Mark setup with Ancestral Protector and Defiance Banner is in here as well. And then the rest of my auras include Determination, Grace, Herald of Agony. You can also consider not using Plague Bearer. Plague Bearer is just there to help you clear out. And then I have a cast damage taken Molten Shell, and then finally my last 3 things include a Withering Step with increased duration, and then I am using Vol Haste. Now this jacks up your damage by a considerable amount, but I think it's actually good to include this in the build. There's not a lot of other low investment things that you can do for a really big boost in damage. I think this will be really good tech for a lot of builds. When you have this link with increased duration, and also I think I have 1 or 2 duration nodes on my tree. I think this mastery right here, you end up getting quite a bit of value out of All Haste. Now speaking of the tree, it looks like a fairly standard poison Helix tree. You're taking some really powerful early nodes, and these are great. And this makes the whole process of leveling really easy. I'll go over the leveling after, but the rest of it is pretty much taking, you know, Chaos Stop Multi, Poison Chance, the Mark Mastery here for Frenzy Generation. And you do have an option for 1 possible cluster setup here, but I think including a cluster setup on a league start, unless it's really important and really powerful and it's worth target farming for, it's probably not worth doing. As far as the Ascendancy goes, I think you gotta take Escape Artist first. And I want to do this first just because you don't get really high value out of Polymath in the early game anyway, because you don't really have a lot of keystones allocated. After that, I'd probably go for Soul Drinker just to get the 20% increased attack speed while you're doing campaign. And then I'd go for Spellbreaker after that to get early suppression, and then this helps you set up the baseline for your gearing, what you want to do. I'd end up with Polymath because by the time you're at Uber Lab, I'm going to guess that you're probably around level 80-ish. And at level 80, you'll probably have most of your keystones allocated. In this particular build, I'm taking, I believe, 11 keystones, but I'm not entirely sure. I kind of forgot. As far as early leveling on this build goes, again, it's really straightforward. You want to go through these Chaos nodes right away. The best early node to grab is Sleight of Hand. That's really fantastic. And then Fangs of the Viper is also really powerful because this gives you increased move speed early on. You want to go down a Life Breaker, grab this, and also grab this. And this gives you greater flexibility for which claw base you use, and it lets you drop the Mana Flask really early on. After this, you're pathing right over to Poison nodes up here, the Poison node down here, and then through this Life node to the last Poison node over here. And this will probably get you to about 100% chance to poison. Now after this is a little bit more flexible, I'm probably going to be going for Charisma relatively early on, just so I can fit in 1 more aura. By Act 6, I want to be using Determination. I think most people want to go for things like a Life Mastery, grabbing the early accuracy down here, grabbing Blood Drinker, and also going for Claws of the Magpie. Because you're poison build, you're actually not in such a rush to do a respec, and I think instead of doing a Cruel Lab respec into Nightblade, which is what I do on Elemental Helix setups, I would actually go for a Merc Lab respec into Nightblade and wait for those points. And to do the respec into Nightblade, you basically want to be grabbing Claws of the Hawk, the Mastery from Claws, the From the Shadows with the Dagger Mastery for Elusive, and then Perfect Agony. And this will give you what you need, but you also really want to be having Ungil's Harmony, because without Ungil's Harmony, you don't have enough base crit chance to really make it worth it to go for a crit early on. All in all, I think this is a fairly good league starter. It's probably in the top tier of league starters, but not necessarily something I would recommend for everyone, because I can't recommend it to everyone. It does rely on at least 3 uniques, Ungil's, Boss Nest 2, which should still be really common, and Covenant, which I have no idea how common this will be. But again, if you don't have Covenant, it's not the end of the world. You still do a lot of damage, it's still a really powerful build. But putting on that chest makes you go from endgame viable into uber viable on really budget gear. But I'm almost certain, with a league that has completely overhauled uniques, I'm sure Grinding Gear Games loves us so much that they'll want us to have access to the new uniques for us to play with, and that they really want us to have fun. And what's more fun than playing Poison Spectral Helix? Again,